You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Stop me if you've heard this one before. Band of weirdos who pseudo live and record in a castle, lose their singer, see a dude busking on the street, invite him to come perform with them. He comes up on stage that night, sings, air quotes, a bunch of unintelligible stuff and goes into a screaming fury. Voila, he's in the band.
Is that what rushing for a fraternity is like?
In Germany. There are almost too many good places to enter the inner space of Can, of this remarkable collective that was too weird to live, and over the years has become one of my favorite things ever, just because they're so idiosyncratic and there's still nothing like them to this day, and almost everything that you would say to try to describe them sounds like a random word generator of ideas. Like when you use autocomplete to write a story with text, Can is sort of that as a band. And I'm really excited to kick the season off by getting super weird and getting into their headspace, because there's a lot to learn from it.
Well, we're going to have to break down that headspace in order for you to learn a lot from it, because God help everyone who came up with all of the decisions on this record that actually created something pretty amazing. But wow, when you break the pieces apart and talk about how this actually happened, the fact that they picked up their vocalist on the street, as you've mentioned, and let him join the band immediately is probably not the weirdest thing going on this record, which is sort of what makes it so worth listening to.
So an important foundational element is that everyone in this group is an excellent and classically trained musician of some kind. And they use the phrase intuitive music to describe themselves rather than the genre descriptor that got applied to them based on where they were based. Music did a racism in describing their sound.
Hold on real fast. Let's just talk about this real fast, just so we can stop the perpetuation of this term, because it's like in Wikipedia. So if we get like 5 people less saying this bullshit is worth it. Okay, listen. Krautrock was a thing made up by British journalists because they were uncreative and unwilling to write their own articles using, words that adults come up with. So they basically used a racial slur and put them together so that Krautrock basically just means rock played by Germans. Yeah. So let's just put that term to rest, okay?
You're right. It basically just does mean weird.
Yeah.
It's like art. Anyway, let's get back to Can, music makers of their own design from Germany. So a couple of the guys, including keyboardist Ermin Schmidt, who in a lot of ways was the spirit of this band. A couple of these dudes studied with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who, if you read this incredible book that Ermin Schmidt co-authored called All Gates Open, that is a tome. I mean, it's like 1,000 pages. It's an enormous book. And when I got it in the post, I was not anticipating how large a book it was going to be. But it covers pretty extensively the lead up to how all these cats came together. So you have Ermin Schmidt, who came from the Stockhausen tradition, and Stockhausen was a famous but notoriously rigid band leader, composer, instructor, that type of person who rooted a couple of these guys in classical traditions. Then you have Jackie Leibowitz, who I know we're going to spend some time talking about, the drummer who came up in the jazz tradition, and ultimately in free jazz included, but ultimately found free jazz too limiting, which is an amazing and wonderful contradiction in terms. The long and short of it is that you have all of these people making music at the highest possible level all over Germany and Europe, and ultimately seeking to unlearn. So as the story goes, Ermin Schmidt goes to New York in 1966 and sees a counterculture happening there and the confluence of different mediums of art, and specifically sees Warhol's Outer and Inner Space short film. And the name Can is originally derived from the Campbell Soup series, right? So with Warhol deconstructing art, and then all of these people deconstructing form in music in New York, like Terry Riley and Steve Reich. You have these really interesting things happening across the pond from them that then go on to inspire these conversations about like, what is the antithesis of everything musical, where we can hold on to just the good parts of making music that we love and destroy everything else about it. So you have a simple process of unlearning that leads to this sort of like revolutionary collective of artists.
And what do you want to do? When you want to deconstruct the essence of something that's been built up, or what do you do when you want to deconstruct where something has ended up and go back to the essence? Like, to me, this helped me really understand Can, and is the reason I want to just go ahead and start off by saying, don't write off this music or this band as being pure chaos, or even, you mentioned them operating at their highest form earlier. I just want to convey there's no reason to think that this album was made just by the madness of drugs. This is meticulously constructed, even if it does not align with what usually sounds meticulous to you. And so, like, so much of what blows my mind about Can was the way that, just like you said, kind of breaking something back down to try to get to that essence, keep the parts of music that we like. So much of what was created on Tago Mago was, let's play until we feel right. And let's just once we have the feeling right, literally, keep it going. And let's just keep that going as long as we feel like we're in the right place. We'll sort out making this into a consumable format, literally, later. Like, we're just going to keep going. That creates a tremendous contrast between them and practically anyone else making what you could even qualify as music at that time, and even begins to stretch the boundaries of what we should consider musical to begin with.
Yeah. Their goal, their North Star, is to break onto the other side by force. So they came from this like deep, rich tradition of German and European music scholars, like trying to really figure out the purpose of music, what it's for, and where it's headed. So there's this essay that gets referenced in the book from 1928. Robert Bayer, who was one of three people in sort of a school of electronic music thought in Germany, who wrote in this essay, "What more can a composer do than to create musical worlds which do not merely mirror the human world as it is today, but which offer visions or intimations of better worlds?" And you made that point about like, will we want to get toward a good performance? They talked about group meld. And specifically, there's this great quote that I can't remember if it was Ehrman or if it was Holger Tuzé, the bassist, said, "Our communication is not intellectual. Our communication is a spiritual communication that happens while we play. We don't hear what the other plays. We listen to ourselves and to what we're doing. And if we're good, if it works, everything melts together and we'll make a good performance." So that sort of faith, that blind trust in something on the other side that we can't think our way to, is such a perfect summation of the process of unlearning, that there are so many things about Can that are really Stone Agey and primitive, from the drums to the vocals to everything, which is remarkable when you consider what storied musicians these dudes are. But just like trying to get to the most essential place with everything, like to really the base part of their brain, is an interesting aspiration for high-minded musicians, like high minds taking the low road.
This boils things down so much that I began to question, listening to this record, the nature and the purpose of rhythm to begin with, and how it relates to how we categorize music from things that we think are not music. And where does that drive to keep the rhythm come from, and what does it have to do? And I think it works on so many layers. This record, it's amazing how much at once the rhythm can keep you in something, and then that lack of rhythm almost makes you feel like you've been abandoned in a place that you shouldn't be left alone, only to pick you back up later. And I think, again, there is this layer, and maybe now's the right time to bring it up, right? The way that these songs are divided, the way that we start with some more accessible songs to begin with, and then build into tracks that take entire sides of LPs, right? I mean, by the time you get to Hallelujah, I mean, you're starting to open up and go, oh, this is going to get weird. And like, you have no idea unless you remember, unless you've listened to this before, you have no idea how weird it's about to get. But, the trajectory of this whole thing is sort of indistinguishable to me from like a well-documented drug trip where like it slowly builds up and you're making sense of things and things feel kind of happy almost and lighthearted. And then they kind of keep breaking apart and like, oh, now I can see all the pieces dissected, except they keep breaking apart and they keep going further and further apart from one another before eventually at the end of the record, at least in my opinion, ending up with a song aptly named Bring Me Coffee or Tea that sort of like brings us back. But throughout this whole record, and I think we'll touch on it in a couple of places, it reminds me of the human need for something like rhythm, something to remind ourselves that we're still okay, that we haven't been lost in the commotion and the noise, that we're not alone. When you're really in it, you really get this feeling of disassociation and almost fear of like, am I going to be found again, right? Mm-hmm. You got to like open your eyes and look around and make physical contact with the space around you just for a moment.
Like in Knocked Up when he's like, oh, I remember what this chair feels like. I like the way it feels to sit in this chair.
Exactly.
Some of that anchoring. Yeah.
Look at this one. Look at it. It's gold and red and it's kind of shiny thread. Unbelievable. It is beautiful and it feels amazing.
The tall one's gawking at me and the short one's being very droll. I don't like them.
Oh, wow.
It's weird that chairs even exist when you're not sitting on them.
I'm up high. I'm really high up.
But that's a basic tenet of mindfulness, right? Like we make stoner jokes, but the two states of being can't exist without the other, right? Like you can't appreciate the good, the light, the rhythm without the atonality and the sheer terror of not having things you are reminded of that ground you, like grounding objects. And they're really necessary. And when you take the record on the whole, it's very hard to sit with the record for its whole running time because it's an extremely physical record that takes you a bunch of different places. But there's enough of that like James Brown song that never starts and ends thing on it where you can just kind of like be there and take the ride.
I'm so glad you said that because like that to me was the connection point and why I wanted to point out like, yeah, in a way, it aligns with all of your drug stereotypes. But just because it aligns with that stereotype doesn't mean that that's its inherent meaning, that was the way that this record was approached or created or intentionally designed to be at all. Just by looking at it from a mindfulness perspective gives you the same like, oh, it seems like they created this like a meditation session that gets tough, right? I mean, legitimately trying to be quiet in this world for more than a few minutes, your brain is going to end up making some of these insane bomb and dog barking noises and shrieks and whatever else that comes out. Like I'd heard it defined before as like, it feels like the monkeys start shaking the trees in your brain and just like stuff starts falling down and you feel real confused. But yeah, I wanted to kind of come right out and say that part of it because it will do this whole record a tremendous disservice if you look at it as like kind of the ramblings of people loosely associated with reality. These people are in it. They did this on very purpose. And so it's just that their entire approach to how the actual raw material would get created is so different than the way that most musicians approached it that it feels foreign.
I think it's interesting that you made it goes all the way out to bring you back in thing. Holger, their bassist, specifically said that the album was an attempt to achieve a mystery musical world from light to darkness and return, which is super interesting when you consider that originally they were only going to put out the one LP. So like all the super weird stuff gets left off, right? The Ohm song, Omgen, I don't know how they want to pronounce it, but we'll call it Ohm, and Pecking O, and then Bring Me Coffee and Tea, were going to be left off until their new manager suggested, like, no, this needs to be a double album. Like, this really needs to be a journey, and you need to put all of this stuff together. So there is sort of the normal half and then sort of the trippy half, but they definitely really need the other. And on the whole, the group refers to it as their magic record, and that's the word that kept appearing over and over. And there's loose and somewhat incorrect connections to Aleister Crowley on this record that don't really wind up being factual when you dig in.
That connection is so frustrating because that's by far not the most interesting thing about this thing being called Tago Mago.
Sure.
Right?
But I think the word magic in like not a scary voodoo sense is the perfect word to encapsulate this record, because there's a threshold that the human mind can get to and communicate about reality and existence. And music is great because it shatters right through that threshold. This one's whole point, and really like the ethos of Can as a band, is to live outside in the void in that 20% and to constantly push to that place beyond words and to live there and to sustain it for as long as possible. And everything is about achieving magic, right? Like 5-6 people doing their own thing, arguably completely separately, and then it magically turns into a piece of music that works is kind of phenomenal. Like unconsciously just blacking out and just kind of doing whatever for 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours in a castle, and then editing it down and adding in layers that don't necessarily work together on their face, and taking moments that weren't even intended to be recorded and adding them in, like the dog barking or like the child screaming, and making those part of the thing. It's like, that is magic. That's the magic of music. Just, you can't try to do it's like, for real, do or do not. There is no try. Like, you just go in a direction and then hope that the results reveal themselves. And it's very different from just jamming. Like, a lot of bands can just jam their way to it, but just like expressing and then editing your way, like they excavate a lot of the album's best moments by piecing unconscious things together consciously. So there's a little bit of best of both worlds on this approach, and it becomes kind of its own compositional way of being.
Yeah, and just to be direct about how they did that, I mean, they literally, so not only did they record just a ton of music, but secondly, one of the more interesting things, which I really enjoy, is they would also, especially the bassist, when he was doing the recording, when he was manning the recording, would just leave it on, even at times where they didn't know that they were being recorded. And I think that maybe gets interpreted as like he knew something special was happening, and so he recorded someone else who was unaware of it. But I don't really think that that's what it was. I think it's this more very like open-ended, open-handed approach to reality. I'm going to leave the tape running because who the fuck knows what's about to happen, because reality is
because there's art in everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just letting those moments bleed in, and then on top of it, to go back and find ways to integrate some of that stuff. I mean, it's so far removed from the parody of field recordings being mixed into like post rock just to be weird. Like, this was more, I really want to see what's going to happen in this space, like in a literal physical space, and then in a space that's shared by people with the same kind of like thinking and approach. And so to be able to take all that material, not only from jamming it out, and to be clear as well, not jamming it out so that they could then write the song, but then literally just recording whatever they did with the moment that they had. And then, as it was expressed, like working with it more like a movie, where you've got hours and hours and hours of tape that you're instead going back through and picking out the best parts of. But the thing that sets this record apart even further, I think, when it comes to that, and why it's worth all of that overture, is because you can start to hear it when you know that that's what's happening in this record, where, I mean, it is literally like they are splicing through time.
Yeah.
They just kind of like shove another place where they went into a different movement here, now. And so you can start to hear it, and it feels more like the thing that they created, where it kind of blows your mind the way that they're jumping between things. It's not just like they're skipping the filler. It's like they're figuring out, like, if I approach music with the premise that the audience will know that we've now totally shifted, what can I do with that?
Right.
Like really changing expectations of who's listening and how, and then just like pushing that even further into we can put together whatever we want.
Well, and the contrast of the two parts of their approach are really interesting when you consider, so like the 18 minutes of Hallelujah are recorded over, they're pieces recorded over months and months, and they're a collage where it's like with the song, of course, you're going to come back to it at different times and you're going to add layers or whatever. But when the whole intent of recording the music is the now and of capturing the vibrations of a moment and like committing the energy of a thing to tape and then putting them together, like the intent for them very much was to flatten a lot of time and space. So it gets really, really heady when you think about it that way.
Well, and to be clear too, like the flattening that you're talking about, like they like kind of shifted around the puzzle pieces of what you usually have to work with on a record. So when we say that they recorded all these things separately and put it back together, we're not talking about they created isolated recordings of each instrument. We're talking about full bleed. I think there were a maximum of like 2 tapes being recorded, 3 tapes.
2 tapes, 3 microphones.
Yeah, and that's it. So like what they're chopping and screwing at that point basically is like a full-on live recording, and then whatever you want to add on to it or manipulate about it. So like, again, I want to make sure people who haven't loved this record yet, like really get the full appreciation. If it's still weird and you don't like it afterwards, that's fine. At least pay attention to how strange this was, and for it to come out so coherent in its own way is an amazing feat.
Yeah, for sure. You touched on the limitations. That's one of the things that's really interesting to me about the process and what really elevates it to art, right? Like they only had the 2-track tape recorder and they like sat it outside and we're all in this one room and they used the bleed to their advantage, right? They were in a hallway in the castle and used the reverberation, and some of the best moments on the record are where they use the space between them really nicely. So like all of Mushroom, the inexplicably weird to this day drum sound on Mushroom is one of the best examples of how they use that weird reverberation to their advantage.
When I saw skies are red, when I saw skies are red, when I saw skies are red, I was born and I was
Also, the fact that they had a limited amount of tape, which sounds counterintuitive because they recorded so much, but all of the tape was, the word I saw used a couple of times was liberated from the WDR studios, from the Studio for Electronic Music. That was
Oh, that's some 70s shit.
right.
But when you think about it, man, who does this stuff really belong to anyway? It's just a plant, man.
Which ties into, they used to joke around with people that CAN stood for communism, anarchism, and nihilism. Not true.
You say that
at
like
all.
it's a bad thing.
But these were like true artists. Like they didn't give a shit about anything except making really cool stuff. And when they were having the early conversations about what the group was going to be, it's like, that was in 1967, going into the political unrest all over the world of 1968. And it's like, we don't want to be an express commentary on that. We just want to be a reaction in style to that kind of a turmoil. And we just want to be pure expressionism. So thinking of them in the like, you know, Vietnam era chaos of the day, I think paints them in a really interesting light because they're from a different place. So they're not responding to the chaos in America, but they have all of their post-war trauma as well, as Germany and as a European society. But they weren't trying to expressly respond to that. So I thought it was really cool that they stole the tapes from that studio that belonged to Stockhausen. So it's a little bit of a finger in the face. It was a huge finger in the face that they like kind of pilfered them overnight on the night shift from Stockhausen's studio, who was the person who had kind of frustrated them into this direction of anti. And they go into that story in a pretty fair amount of depth in the book. So that interesting piece of backstory and of exposition is an interesting reason to read the first 200 pages of the book or so. if you find yourself wanting to go down this rabbit hole. If you want to pinpoint a couple of the moments where the use of tape and of the improvise edit combo were really interesting, there's kind of one on each half of the record for me. The first one is Oh Yeah, the third song. So it started with, they had a rhythm tape, then they played the tape backwards and played on it, and then they turned it back around. So it's like a dub within a dub within a dub. And that was inspired by modern compositional techniques, but it winds up having this sort of like frenetic mix between reggae and Kraftwerk thing. But it's very disorienting because it's moving in two directions at once. So that is a technique, a compositional technique that could have only been achieved by their recording approach. On the second half, so there's Ohm and Pecking O, and both are like supremely heady moments on the back half. But in Pecking O, the middle passages in there specifically, there's like separately a drum machine freak out and keyboard freaking out, and then a call and response section with Damo and the keyboard. And to me, it sounds like if Death Grips got really into the Grateful Dead, it was just like hippie Death Grips, because it never really gets that loud and blown out, but it's really freaked out. So if you're into the sort of deconstructed Death Grips clipping approach to finding like pure raw expression, then Pecking O is like, just go in there and take that nightmare ride. That's the freakiest that the album gets, is second to last. So much so that there's a palate cleanser at the end after that. But it's tight. There's nothing like it still. It's really weird. And to think that it came out in 71, and like weird stuff was happening back then, right? So like Are You Experienced had been out a couple of years at that point. I think, yeah, Electric Ladyland would have been out by that point as well. So like Hendrix had done a lot of crazy stuff with backmasking and turning tape around, and they talked in a couple of places where some of his work was influential. But this is just so far beyond any of the most aggressively experimental American and British stuff that it's in its own world.
You know, thinking of it that way gave me a really interesting perspective on this record, which I imagine, I think you've loved Tago Mago specifically a lot longer. I mean, I've always been fine with Can. I knew about him, if for no other reason than I was trying to think the other day, like, why would I know about Can? I'm sure my dad probably told me about him, but also, you know, it's the autocomplete when you're searching for canned heat, and it reminds you a little early on, like, oh no, there's a better band, just hold on. Like, oh, okay. But trying to understand them in the context of kind of what you were just touching on opened up a weird world to me, because I think one of the reasons this feels so foreign is because, as opposed to experimental recording techniques of people who are considered popular artists or just pop music, right, in the more general sense, right? Like even Jimi Hendrix would be included in that level of artistry. People who are making music for, generically speaking, mass consumption. You know, we've talked already about all the influences and all the background and training of every member of Can. I mean, they're kind of at the nexus of psychedelia in terms of where popular music was going and modern compositional techniques, which you've touched on. But it's hard to get a grip on how it's almost like it normalizes how weird Can is to think about experimental composers who were around that time or who came before them. So not just their direct influence or people who were providing castles for them, I suppose, but also like, so the particular instance that made me think really deeply about this record was like, okay, 1952, John Cage comes out with the 4 minutes and 33 seconds thing, right? Okay, so I promise this aside will be worthwhile, because this kind of blew my head open about this record specifically. So 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which will never, ever get a podcast episode from us, is like the backstory of this whole thing. I mean, in case you're not familiar with it at all, like the entire composition is as John Cage wrote it, was someone comes out, opens up a piano, sits at it in silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and then closes the cover back and walks away. The too long didn't read of this whole thing is that it's about silence. Yeah, but the reason this came up at all is because John Cage is studying Zen Buddhism at the time and is putting himself in environments which eliminate outside noise. And so for the first time, John Cage, prior to writing this or composing 4 minutes and 33 seconds, is experiencing for the first time like that tremendously frightening actual silence, like not the one you normally get if you plug in noise canceling headphones in an airplane, but like that thing where actually all that noise you don't know is laying under everything else gets taken away and you're down to where you can't hear anything. And you realize how much of your existence is threatened by sensory deprivation. Like there's an undercurrent of stimulation. There's like a base level reading that your body's doing all the time that you're not aware of. Yeah. And when you start pulling away those layers, the only thing left at that point is your heartbeat. Now, John Cage, and this is a funny aside about the aside too, John Cage walked away from that experience having heard not only his heartbeat, but also the flow of blood through his own veins, which it would later be argued in a great book that maybe you just actually had tinnitus, dude. People aren't supposed to be able to hear that. And yet his entire composition was based on basically this idea that even in absolute silence, there is no such thing as absolute silence. And so it became a fun composition to force everyone else to experience basically, 4.5 minutes of abject and forced silence in a room of people. But to me, this is why this rabbit hole is worth following. You get all the way down to it and you start thinking about, as you brought up earlier, there's this connection with mindfulness and almost a sense of meditation on this record, which feels counterintuitive considering how abrasive it is. But when you think deeply about like what are the corollaries between a deeply meditative experience and honestly like just being jacked up on psychedelic drugs and watching somebody go through a whole concert, it's like the reason we as humans are so drawn to that beat, it's literally natural in us. You can take all the sound away, and at the end of the day, the one thing that's left that you can never get rid of is that thump in your heart, which also scientifically is affected by the music that you're listening to. There's a deep connection between the way that your body has its innate rhythm and your ability to basically keep your head about you in overwhelming experiences. And so to start climbing all the way back out of this rabbit hole, the literal opposite of creating music, John Cage's composition of silence, made me think really deeply about why it is that inside of Tago Mago, for instance, like you yearn for that beat once it goes away. And it's that terrifying feeling of silence almost. Because even though you're surrounded by noise, it's not meaningful and it's not directional and it gives you no rhythm. And so as you go all the way through some of these super freaked out songs, once you eventually come back and they bring the rhythm back, it's like a relief. It's like, oh, I didn't lose myself. I'm still here and I'm still able to track with this whole thing. And like finding those different ways, I think for me, of appreciating the way that they were trying to put music together by thinking really deeply about their true influences outside of just popular psychedelia, like really led me to appreciate. And I'm going to put this out there, and this is true. Like I meditated to this record and it works in this really strange way. It's hard and it's distracting, but it really matches those experiences when you're able to just let go and let stuff come at you. You can't talk about this record or this band without talking about rhythm. Yeah. I use the phrase cosmic rhythm. So Jackie Liebezit is, for my money, pound for pound, one of the best and most important drummers there ever was in rock and roll. So a number of different ideas related to time and timekeeping and a broader idea of cosmic rhythm came up as we were doing research. So like a number of them were studied in the music of the spheres. So this ancient Grecian concept of musica universalis, like one of the three types of music that like
the cosmos have a rhythm. The movement of the planets all have sort of a rhythmic harmony, right? And you get into some of those like golden circle type mathematics of here's how the rhythm of all of the cosmos are organized. So there is something to be said for tapping into that. The guy who wrote the 33 and a third book about this album, Alan Warner, had a great quote that sums it up really nicely. He said, "On each tune, I find some other rhythmical idea. I think it's like astronomy. The further you get into it, the more stars you can see." So the rhythm is what kind of illuminates everything because it's like the train ride that helps you see all the sights. Another really great one, because by the same token of it holding it steady, it also manipulates the perception of time. Jackie's very particular in that way. And another sort of like time and space thing. There are other time proportions underwater than on Earth. Time there has other durations. The lengths become longer and the brevities briefer. The drummer is the connecting link between instrumental phrases or phases. So the idea that he's sort of a maestro and that some of these crazy disparate things that are happening, you talk about craving the rhythm coming back. It's not necessarily to be nice to you and to save you from the crazy stuff. It's to point you in a new crazy direction, like kind of a psychedelic hub and spoke thing. The prime example, and we've name dropped it a number of times, is Hallelujah. It's 18 minutes and the beat is consistent more or less the entire song. And it's there the whole time. So there are songs that are essentially percussionless or compositions that are mostly without percussion on this thing. But Hallelujah is a beat that you can imagine having no beginning and no end. It started before you arrived on the track and it's going to keep going long after you're gone, which was a very James Brown, JB's inspired thing. That was their whole deal live. It was just the drummer could just keep it going into infinity.
Just to make sure we press on that just for a second before you keep going, like James Brown is all over this record in really weird ways, all the way down to the way that, you know, Dama Suzuki would talk about song titles in the songs. That's James Brown shit. Everyone was so jacked up on what James Brown was doing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's easy to forget how much of a godfather he was of so many different types of things and so many touches in music. I mean, it feels like he was our first MC, you know?
We're going to make them out. Now, brother, since everybody's in the groove and the funk and feeling good, we want to keep them kind of clapping their hands, stomping their feet and things. Look at him. Strike out on the horn and get down a little bit. Make sure you get down. It's all right. Right about now, hit me. Get it. Yeah.
Yeah, Damo referencing his own songs in the song.
Mushroom head, oh yeah, paper house.
And just the fact that they had a song called Oh Yeah that seemed to exist for the purpose of being like, oh yeah, it's our song. It's great. And like, Damo gets more spectacular the longer you listen to him because there's so little regard for structure or for language or for anything. And I don't know if Kurt Cobain ever listened to a note of Can in his entire life, but that idea coming from people like Damo Suzuki where nothing has to mean anything and lyrics don't matter, it's just about feel. It's like, I still don't think I've come across anybody that I think does that better and less ridiculously and less self-awarely than Damo. And he's still doing it to this day. Like he's still performing to this day and still staying true to kind of his pure ideals about what music and performance should and shouldn't be.
A decent attempt, though. It might not be better. But, you know, we covered Francis the Mute. And if you're a Mars Volta fan and you have not somehow heard Tago Mago, you need to drop everything you're doing.
For sure.
And figure out where that music came from. Because this is for sure, like, you can clearly see the connection not only between this record and Radiohead. And that should be laid fairly obvious in the first few records from Radiohead in general. But so much of what the Mars Volta did, including the way that they approach things, seems to have originated here at least. And so here, when we're talking about the vocals and the way that there doesn't necessarily need to be a structure. First of all, it's in a mixture of English, German, or Japanese at any point. Those things can coexist. He mispronounces things pretty much on purpose and then says, you know, things that aren't even words in any language. And like we mentioned during Francis the Mute that was how some of Cedric's vocals were created, where Omar put a bunch of television screens in a room on different channels and just asked Cedric to just say whatever came to his mind based on hearing the music, and basically recorded and kept gibberish scratch tracks. And so it's like Can did the same thing, except they were even more committed to it because they knew in advance this would probably be the way it would turn out.
But so there are lyrical scholars for Damo as much as there can be a thing. Like there are people who have invested a lot of time in trying to decipher what he unconsciously or otherwise was trying to say. Not that that really matters to any degree.
Do you think the mushroom head is about a bomb, Kyle?
Because he's Japanese and the plight of the Japanese people in post-war Japan and rebuilding and all of that. This is NPR. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but there are a couple of moments. So like, yeah, Mushroom, if you want to get serious about like maybe they had a political moment, but in all likelihood, probably not. If anything, it's more about him like exercising personal trauma or something like that than making a political statement, because they were staunchly non-political. But one of the hooks or refrains on Hallelujah is the searching for my blood flow, yes I am. Like that song is the most perfect distillation of the Can discography and ideals to me, because they're striving for a state of total mental and physical awareness. The droning beat is what separated them from some of their higher art peers. And I arrived at them by way of Queens of the Stone Age, because Josh, with the first Queens album, was trying to do Stooges' attitude and the beauty of a Can drone, like just the way that they approached it differently from the minimalist composers like a Terry Riley. And they had more of an edge than Velvet Underground, who we haven't touched on yet, but were an inspiration to them as well, right? Yeah, it just all kind of comes to a head on Hallelujah. And then you have all of these other, it's the centerpiece of the album for a reason. And you have all of these other experiments, like parts of the journey. But if you look at it like a descent into and out of darkness and sort of a heroic Shakespearean arc, that's the mountaintop before you descend down and come down the other side.
One of my favorite anecdotes that it feels related to going in and out of darkness and returning to light. We hinted about this a little bit earlier, just where the title of the record came from at all. So yeah, not actually very related to Aleister Crowley in the way that he was related to the island called Tago Mago, but that this came up as a suggestion for naming the album within the group. And the way it was put was this was kind of a surprising suggestion, because it came from the drummer who was playing with Chet Baker in Barcelona in the 60s. And if you don't know who Chet Baker is, that's your homework assignment for the week. But the drummer remembered this island of Tago Mago from going on tour with Chet Baker. And it was a surprising recommendation, because apparently the drummer didn't love his time playing with Chet Baker, probably because Chet Baker was super strung out on stuff that was apparently 3 times stronger than morphine. But it was interesting because like this island's relationship to the drummer and Chet Baker and all this was basically he rented a place, Chet Baker rented a place in Tago Mago and wanted to commit suicide every single day by jumping off a cliff on that island into the sea. Turns out he didn't, probably thanks to the support of people around him, I would guess. But just like a weird moment of this island sort of represents it's something different, like kind of as you pointed out, it's something different and more nuanced than voodoo or bad vibes or anything like that. Like there's a mystical type of darkness to this place called Tago Mago, and it comes from a number of different places. And this record takes you to those mystical dark places, but somehow kind of never quite leaves you there. and always finds a way to bring you back, right? And so like I try to really avoid, anytime in the podcast where we're like, it is just really great the way that they did that. It's so good.
The whole point of this album is that it's beyond a place where words can go. So if there's one album where that's an okay excuse, it's this one.
Yeah, we kind of run out of adjectives for a group of people dive headfirst into what it means for your brain to start releasing its grip on reality for a little while, and actually finds a way to not only map it out, but then also to recreate it by not trying to specifically recreate it, and just let open-ended recording happen and then recollect and then chop and put on top of each other. And then honestly at different times, which I think I relayed to you after I listened to it one time, just like some of the interruptions when it comes to like sound effects and stuff are like border on trolling. They're so ridiculous the way that they come out of nowhere and kind of shock you. And like even on especially Pegging O, which you mentioned earlier, I mean, the volume changes. Like it messes with your ability to maintain any level of constant throughout the music, but it's like they're clearly aware of how far away they are from the center and always have a plan for bringing it back, which is what makes some of their contemporaries so good, right? Like even if you take those Radiohead or Mars Volta examples, like the things that people love about it is how far out it can go and then come right back in with the thing you had before. And this is more or less like the genesis of the ability to do that sort of thing in a complex way.
So in a lot of ways, Hallelujah is kind of that obvious favorite for me on this record. A lot of the things that you've touched on, like the meditation, the going back in and layering lots of noises together, and then certainly the trying to achieve a meditative headspace. Like if we're talking about that part of it, we got to talk about Ohm a little bit. That's AUMGN. So the only track kind of as long as Hallelujah, built up from stuff recorded in real time over a 2-day period in the live room. And it's just a montage of noises all kind of put together in a collage. But the Ohm chant is the directional pull. It is sort of the rhythmic element underneath, but it is alarmingly non-rhythmic after a time. It was described in All Gates Open in the book as the album's most genuine electronic meditation with polylinear mixing suggesting access to multiple universes. So it goes the farthest out, right? But I mean, Ermin Schmidt signed off on that line as a co-author of the book. So I have to believe that, like, yes, okay, that was part of the intent.
That's legit.
Deliberately or otherwise. So the two long songs I think are good contrast, good bookends to one another at the middle of the record to kind of see how grounded and how far out it can go. But then Ohm also does that freaky like tea kettle whistle thing as it goes on, and there's a drum circle tribal drum freak out underneath it. So even it relies on rhythm in a totally different way. It's like rhythm as chaos. Like in Hallelujah, it's the backing element, the grounding element, like the beat kind of keeps it pulled back on a leash a little bit, and then it accelerates it. So I think that's just another testament to the genius of Jackie as a drummer, that he knew exactly where the thing needed to go at any given time. And the other band members described him as a little bit of a dictator, but the fact that everything was so driven by rhythm in the most pivotal moments of this album is important to note.
Part of what I do when I'm listening to these is I try to create just like kind of real-time reaction notes just because I think that they're fun. And I remember with Pegging O, like really trying to dive in and let the whole thing happen. I wrote down at 5 minutes and 26 seconds into that, I just wrote complete shock. Just because like things move so quickly between them all. But the ability to like stick in there and listen to it that way and let it come back to you rhythmically is rewarding in a way. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, like bringing this all the way back up to bring me coffee or tea at the end, and just that feeling of being grounded again, kind of like I've made it through a journey, and then to finish out this record of generally nonsensical lyrics that may or may not have connection to reality, to finish it with yes, I'm again, over and over. And just like more to your point, right? Like this, it feels like too spacey of a take on meditation for it to be taken seriously. But like, I think we really want to challenge people to take it seriously. Like this approach to music and composition is done in earnest. It's not making fun of the journey. This is really trying to describe what it's like, and to be able to go all the way through something like this and come back and just say, yes, I am again. Like, I mean, it feels so wild for it to have been so nonsensical the whole time, and then so obvious for them to come back to a song where he's asking pretty constantly, like, are you dead? No, I am again. Like, okay.
But I like that he's also like, bring me coffee or tea. I don't care which. After everything I've been through, it doesn't really matter. Just bring me a drink and call me pretty little bee. I am again. I am reborn. I was born. I was dead.
What a wild dude. Honestly, like, what bravery to kind of like put yourself out there like that. Like this feels like I would be embarrassed if this came out of my brain. I was like, these are my lyrics for this particular song. But it's, again, it's done so in earnest, and you can see that so clearly throughout the way that they create all this music that it becomes infectious, in terms of being able to hop along and follow their kind of passion down that rabbit hole.
Damo is state of flow made sentient. Like, he is just a personification of flow state. There's a great Red Bull Music Academy interview with him from a couple of years ago, where even when he's just answering basic questions, you're just kind of like, what? Everything about him. Like, sometimes you just come across creative people where they just existed on their own wavelength their entire life, and it's like they couldn't have been anything but an artist, but an expressionist. And I don't know many more pure artists than Damo Suzuki. Like, his life is his art. Not to be cliche, but
it's more like reading a Faulkner novel if the way that he wrote novels was just like speaking endlessly, and then like went back and edited his own recordings. Like, we're going to call this The Sound and the Fury now.
I will say, this record, to a point you made earlier, may not be for everyone, but I think if you're into the idea of creativity and really going for it, and there's something about Can's sound that is really appealing to you, but this one just gets a little too freaked out. They had an amazing 3-album stride after this, like starting with this record. So like Monster Movie is cool, and then Soundtracks, the compilation of the work that they'd done for films, is also cool. The Malcolm Mooney era stuff. But then there's Tago Mago, and then Ege Bamyasi, the one with the actual Can on the cover, probably their tightest and most accessible in a lot of ways. It's got Spoon, which was the closest thing to a single they ever had. And it's got Vitamin C, which was featured on the Inherent Vice trailer. Kind of weird that they were ever a band where that was a thing that could have happened. And then Future Days, which is a record that they recorded. I can't remember if it was Beachside, but basically it was like they recorded that whole album somewhere with the doors and windows open, and it has a more airy quality to it as a result. Bel Air and Spray and Moonshake. It's like the lightest, airiest, breeziest, sunniest Can record. So if you don't like how dark and freaky this one gets, try Future Days instead. They're a good light in the dark. Neither is one state exclusively, but there's certainly more one than the other. The point is, this band rules, and it's a bit of a stretch to get into them if it's not really like inherently your thing sound wise, but I think you're rewarded for the challenge because they're still so different than anything else that came before them or after them.
Okay, so let's say it again louder for the people in the back. When there's an artist who has a catalog that's difficult to get into, and we're picking an entry point for you, it's just one perspective on seeing the whole catalog. I was hoping to like have more rant after that, but I realized I don't give a fuck really about that anymore. So yeah, I mean, Can is 100% capable of making a great rock and roll song that's accessible to the masses, as evidenced by other songs that they made. So just like +1 to that, right? Like, as opposed to this being the most accessible way to get into a difficult to get into band, this is kind of going in through the outdoor a little bit. But I think is it maybe the primary way both of us were initially exposed to Can, or in a way that made us interested? I don't know.
For sure.
For me, it was this record, for sure, just because of how strange it is.
For sure. And speaking of in through the outdoor, I sort of half jokingly described this record to you, and I didn't want to write it into the episode description as this is Led Zeppelin 4 in an alternate timeline where everyone has galaxy brain. Like, if fundamentally everyone is just smarter, this is like the rock and roll record, and Hallelujah is their stairway to heaven. So maybe think of it that way. It's like art rock, but Led Zeppelin 4. And thanks to everybody who tried really hard to compare them to like The Who and Zeppelin, and especially Pink Floyd. There are a lot of Pink Floyd comparisons. Metal came out the same year as this record, and a lot of the British journalists compared Metal and Tago Mago, which seems completely insane in retrospect. It was just like, these are the two records that are weird hippie stuff, but for completely different kinds of hippies. Seems unfathomable to try to compare those two artists, and especially those two albums now. But yeah, Can exists on their own plane. So stick your hand through the mire, Interstellar style, and see what you reach in and find on the other side. Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.